We have put a huge amount of effort into compliance. How do you think this actually happened? How do you think this was able to go effectively undetected for so long?
As the superannuation system has been getting bigger and bigger, the industry as a whole needs to be on guard to the fact it becomes more and more attractive to scams, fraud, and a whole range of criminal conduct.
Inside the superannuation system, there are great protections. Outside the superannuation systems, there aren't great protections. How do you think we should be leaning into that as an industry?
What Shield and First Guardian kind of exposed to us is all the way through the value chain, there was a bit of buck passing about who was responsible for what.
If you can start to measure risk, then the next question comes to insurance. Should there be insurance for this? If so, who should pay? And how should that be managed? Today I'm joined by Blake Briggs, who's the CEO of the FSC in Australia. I'm sure most of you know who the FSC is and what they're doing. At the moment, I would consider them one of the real thought leaders in the future of financial services in Australia. They've been putting together research pieces, they've been working with the industry, and they're thinking hard about what the future of the industry needs to look like as we face into demographic and financial challenges. I'm slightly off topic today with Blake, and something that we've talked a little bit about personally. We're talking about scams in the industry. Why we're interested in this is that when pools of capital get large, then scams and bad behaviour starts to appear. It's really important that we've got a view on this in the industry, and it's really important that our thought leaders are thinking about that. Blake, if we start to think about the past few months, there's been a couple of pretty nasty surprises in the industry. Take me through your thinking of how things like that just occurred, apart from the fact that there's just large pools of capital.
Yeah, look, you're spot on to begin with. I think as the superannuation system has been getting bigger and bigger, the industry as a whole needs to be on guard to the fact it becomes more and more attractive to scams, fraud, and a whole range of criminal conduct. Look, the industry is going through the ramifications of what happened to the Shield and First Guardian failures at the moment. That will have implications for both how the industry responds in terms of what good conduct and compliance looks like, but it'll also flow through to consumers' wariness about trusting different parts of the value chain, from financial advisors through to fund managers and superannuation funds themselves. And it's also a bit of a wake-up call for the regulators about how they go about keeping an eye on the industry and making sure that poor conduct, when it's being reported, action's taken against it.
Yeah, I think that's really right. One of the things that I'm interested in getting your opinion on is that this can't be a surprise. We have put a huge amount of effort into compliance. How do you think this actually happened? How do you think this was able to go effectively undetected for so long?
Oh, look, I mean, surprise isn't necessarily the right or wrong word. It was inevitable that people, bad actors would be trying to find opportunities to steal money. I mean, we've seen everything from things like the cyber attacks early this year through the Shield and First Guardian failures. One of those, on face value, looks likely to have been fraud, but the other one probably wasn't fraud. It was just poor management of an MIS. And so it's not a question of how do these things not go detected. It's a matter of what processes should have been in place to check whether or not these products were coming to market, how they were being advised on and the conduct of the advisors that were referring these products, how they got onto platforms, what due diligence was done, what ongoing monitoring was happening, as well as the research and ratings agencies that were looking at them. So what we at the FSC have been trying to do is lead a discussion where we have almost a value chain approach, where we look at the types of failures that occurred at different parts of the value chain and what the industry could be doing to try to address some of those, where the regulatory regime is already adequate but better compliance would be necessary, versus where there's actually deficiencies in law and where law reform or regulatory change might be appropriate.
I think you're thinking about that the right way. There is kind of multiple layers of what's going on in the space. And if we think about this in just a very normal and human way, in any network, we assume that there is a kind of measurable number of bad actors. And the research suggests that's associated with what's called narcissistic personality disorder, where people just don't care about the effect that they have on other people, and they're prepared to steal money. And maybe you're right, there's two cases going on here. Maybe it could just badly managed, and maybe it could be theft. The outcome's not clear on that yet, and it's too early for us to judge that or make a call on it. But if we say that's the case and there's 13,000 financial planners, and let's say that 5% of them have narcissistic personality disorder, it's kind of the top of the range, right? But then you can start to measure the kind of likelihood of risk which lives inside the system. So if you can start to measure risk, then the next question comes to insurance. Should there be insurance for this? If so, who should pay? And how should that be managed? What are your members saying about that?
So I'll deal with the risk part first. I think the point lands well that the risk is inevitable and should be measured and managed for. It's also unpredictable. So you can try to anticipate things like poor investment performance and have the processes in place to try to keep poorly performed products off a platform or not advise on them, or weed them out when they've been on a platform in a while but it's turned. But in the cases of fraud, for example, you've actually got organisations falsifying their returns to try to collect the money for the purpose of getting it offshore, and money disappears. So there just needs to be internal vigilance in that regard to the different types of risks to consumers that can arise. On the question of, effectively, how do we underwrite the system, or should we be considering that? There are proposals being talked about in the industry at the moment about in a large system where people are compelled to put their superannuation away by law, they should be able to have faith that the money will be there for them, won't be subject to this sort of conduct. Some of the options that have been thrown out there should there be a national pool where superannuation accounts are levied a small amount to fund a national pool to bail out in these sorts of organisations. To be honest, putting aside the merits of that argument, I just think it's extremely unlikely that it would be done by this government. I think a lot of organisations and one super fund is unlikely to want to bail out another through a levy system. But then that gets us to the Part 23 applications that we've been seeing very recently. The same sorts of issues are being thrown up. So for those that aren't familiar with the nuances of superannuation law, Part 23 allows a superannuation fund to apply to the government to effectively socialise the losses caused by fraud or theft. Prima facie, that might apply to what's happened, particularly at First Guardian. And so now the minister has a very difficult decision around whether or not that situation warrants the socialisation of the losses. It has the pros of trying to get money back into people's pockets very quickly, but it has the cons of all of the other entities that don't feel responsible for these failures having to reach into their members' pockets to fund the loss.
It's so tricky and so vexed, that question, isn't it? Because in your heart you want to make these people whole again, but it's not really the role of everybody else to do that. One of the things that we were talking about before is that the people who are potentially embarking on these scams are embarking a kind of risk which they don't understand, and certainly leaning into that. Education fulfills a big problem in this country because every piece of research that we do shows that people aren't as well educated about this as they perhaps should be, and the variance in returns isn't well understood. Is this a gap in your members' armoury, or is this something we should be leaning into? And if so, who funds that?
Yeah, it's a gap in the whole system's armoury, to be honest. If you look at some of the consumer interviews that came out of Shield and First Guardian, almost consistently across all of them was a common thread that they weren't happy with the 10 to 12% returns they'd been getting the last couple of years. And then when someone contacted them to say, we can offer you higher rates of returns, they jumped at the opportunity. Now, first of all, it's extraordinary that a system that's performing as well to generate those high returns and people are still, hoping for more. Because I think for anyone that has a high level of financial services experience, the idea of 10 to 12% returns for a long period of time is extraordinary. But it's also a deeply human thing to be scared that you're not going to have enough when you retire. And so when someone says you can get a better outcome, you're crazy not to think about it. So you have to have sympathy for those that were caught up in it as well.
I agree. And the challenge with this is many of those were approached. People found them and approached them and said, hey, you can do better.
And used pressure selling and cold calling or using the hooks of comparison websites to generate a lead. So they were very smart in some ways at how they targeted people who were vulnerable and worried about their superannuation balances. And it goes to that overarching point of the average Australian should be able to have faith that their superannuation money will be there for them when they need it, and that we have the systems in place to protect them from that cohort of bad actors that will always be there no matter how hard we try. One final point I wanted to make, though, on the who bails out the situation, putting aside what may or may not happen on the Part 23 application, if it's not paid out, a lot of this will end up on the CSLR anyway. Not all of it, but a significant chunk will flow through the CSLR if people don't get compensation through other channels. And so through one mechanism or another, the costs of it are going to be socialised through different pockets of the industry, and it is a very difficult situation to resolve.
Is the CSR limited in how much it can pay out in any year?
Limited to $150,000 per consumer, not limited in how much it can pay out per year, but in the event that it exceeds subsector caps, the government has to make a hard decision around, does it levy the same sectors more, does it levy different sectors, or does it slow down the rate of payment so consumers get their money later? Neither of those are good options, to be honest. So there's a fairly gnarly policy issue to work through.
Yeah, just another one for the current government to focus on.
I do feel for the new minister. He's been in the job for 6 months and he's got some very difficult ones to already work through.
He seems pretty steady.
Yeah.
Hey, one of the questions I guess without notice is that one of the things we've been doing at CoreData is collecting a lot of the advertisements that appear, particularly in social media on this space, and there are a lot. And they are promising good outcomes.
The comparison websites and things like that.
Or simply saying 15% a year. I've seen up to 100% a year being offered for litigation funding and encouraging people to put their superannuation into the system. Most of those ads are asking people to leave the superannuation system and invest in something else, but treating it as something else. Inside the superannuation system, there are great protections. Outside the superannuation systems, there aren't great protections.
Yep.
How do you think we should be leaning into that as an industry?
Yeah, I think one of the things that will have to come out of this is legislative reform around that generation process. And it is one that I know Treasury and ASIC are looking at closely with, and we've had discussions around it. You cannot have a situation where organisations can circumvent things like the hawking laws by virtue of how they've structured their lead generation. I think a sensible approach there, for example, would be require the provider of those services to have an AFSL so that you have a hook into them so that ASIC can more readily take action. And if they don't have an AFSL, it's a pretty clear red flag that a particular website or cold calling service is swimming outside the flags and action can be taken.
There's no doubt there's going to be more of this rather than less of this. It just is happening all over the world. And people are, it's the new theft. Your house is unlikely to be burgled now, but your superannuation may be attacked or your bank account may be attacked. What are the three critical things that you think the industry should be focusing on to protect themselves against this?
So the first thing I'll start with is we need to have a discussion about what we as an industry think people should be guaranteed for. Now, we've got the Shield and First Guardian examples at the moment which have brought on this debate, but you also had things like the cyber attacks against Australian Super earlier this year. You've got a constant pipeline of run-of-the-mill scam kind of conduct where, phishing exercises trying to get your credentials and the like. We need to collectively decide and with the government about where consumers should be protected in terms of a national framework for guaranteeing their super versus where people, the risk is unacceptable and so it's not part of a guarantee. Things like the Part 23 application that we're dealing with at the moment are getting caught up in debates around default versus choice and competitive business models, and there's a lot of commercial self-interest creeping into it. But we do need to lift it a bit higher than that, which is this sort of a conduct that we as an industry agree that consumers should be protected and their savings should be guaranteed? Or is it the sort of thing where individual organisations are on their own to decide how they're going to make their consumers whole? Because as soon as you set that principle, let's say, for example, the Australian Super cyber attack, they'd taken 100 million instead of 1 million. Should the system bail out Aussie Super for its losses because it underinvested in its cybersecurity systems? You start applying the principles of this situation to other ones and it gets much more difficult to decide what's inside the line and what isn't unless we have that conversation first.
That's a very tricky one. The
so that wasn't
piece.
A list of three, but
that's a very good answer. But I mean, that becomes a tricky problem, right? Because as soon as something is insured, then does vigilance stop or it's insured? Who cares?
And that's a very good point.
This is a victimless crime, right? The government's going to bail it out, and they've got infinite ability to print money, whereas that's not true.
And no, it's a very good point. You want to ensure that there is the discipline within the industry to invest in their own processes to make sure that these incidences arise as little as possible. And you would say the same about the CSLR. If we want to avoid claims landing on the CSLR, we collectively as an industry need to identify the bad actors more readily, report them to ASIC. ASIC needs to ensure it acts quickly, but we also need to make sure the types of products that the bad actors are selling aren't available to consumers. So whether that's things like capital requirements for fund managers or licensing obligations, there is a lot more things or changes we could be looking at to make sure the system is more resilient.
You're in a position to actually get these messages out there. I mean, I can say stuff, but who cares to a certain extent what CoreData says? But what do you want to talk about?
Oh, look, I mean, how much time do you have? Look, I think one of the topics that we're going to need to grapple with is responsibility in the value chain. So what Shield and First Guardian kind of exposed to us is all the way through the value chain, there was a bit of buck passing about who was responsible for what. So lead generation was occurring, advice businesses were paying lead generators or receiving what looked a lot like conflicted remuneration for their services. Then there was fund managers who, likely conducting fraud and based on how it was structured. Then you had platforms that, were allowing these products onto the platforms all the way through the rating agencies that gave them perhaps inappropriately high ratings. So you look through that and you go, and as soon as ASIC started peeling it back, a lot of the organisations were pointing to responsibility to each other, saying, well, it's not our responsibility as an advice business. The platforms should never have let them on. If we do that as an industry, then I think the government and the regulators are quite right to not have faith that we take responsibility for each of our own parts of the value chain. And the natural result of that is a lot of the innovative smaller businesses would probably get flushed out because it's the big conglomerates that own multiple steps of the process that have the processes in place to give the regulators comfort that there's enough oversight. And I don't think that's necessarily a healthy industry. What I think the conversation we need to be having is how do we make sure each part of that value chain is doing its job very well and is well regulated and being monitored, and only good actors are allowed in that part of the system. But then other parts of the value chain can have faith and rely on each part doing their job well, so that we're not marking each other's homework and there's also no buck passing. I think a lot of the debate that we've been having over the last couple of months has been about looking at each section in isolation, and we're losing the forest for the trees. I think we need to be able to talk about how we as an industry as a whole work more effectively together to be more efficient, lower cost, but also robust at each stage of the process.
So one of the reactions to this has been is the Macquarie reaction, which is to make people whole, which is an extraordinary thing. And I think I understand economically and commercially why. It's going to have a very interesting effect on their competitors and the way in which they're going to have to deal with this. The other thing that they've done is cleaned up their platform. Well, cleaned up's my word. I mean, to reduce the number of opt-ins on their platform to businesses only of substantial size. Yep. Does that lead to kind of an endless homogeneity in the industry? If only people with more than, let's call it 50 billion can actually be investable and be trusted in this space, how do we get variation? How do we build an industry? How do we actually make that true?
Yeah, so Macquarie showed a willingness to use their balance sheet to put this to bed for themselves, but then also took quite a dramatic step of de-risking their platform. So I think there's a lot of organisation, a lot of fund managers who are adversely impacted by being taken off the platform, who are great Australian fund managers in particular, but don't have that scale that Macquarie felt was necessary just to ensure the level of safety that they needed. I don't think that behaviour will flow through to all of the other platforms. I think they see this as part of their core business to have that breadth of choice of options. But more importantly, and this is something that I think the regulators need to stare into as they do their own scrutiny of platform operators, is what impact will that risk aversion have on capital allocation in the Australian economy and the growth of the funds management industry in Australia. One of the things that the FSC has always been a champion of is even though a lot of our members are medium and large size fund managers, we've actually been really proud of the fact that any good stock picker can hang up their own shingle and open a boutique funds management business, and the low barriers to entry made it really, really competitive. And that imposes a great discipline, but it also allows them to find the companies to invest in that improves economic efficiency in Australia. If we are driving a culture of risk aversion amongst the platforms that congregates around the very largest fund managers, then do we lose that dynamism in the Australian economy that actually is a hamper on growth? And it's one of the issues that keep me awake at night, to be honest.
So if you think about that in a different form, one of the things that we see, we do a lot of high net worth research, and we say that's people with more than $2 million in the market, outside principal place of residence, outside their superannuation, so $2 million in the market, and there's, give or take 500,000 of those people in Australia. They're looking for variation all the time. They're looking for an interesting thing. They're looking and chasing those kind of opportunities, partly because money's score of achievement, partly because they're bored, partly because that's the sort of thing you do when you've got a lot of money and you're looking for those kind of opportunities.
And you can take more risk with that variable dollar. So you want to find the brilliant investor.
Yeah. And so if that's not available to them, then they're going to find a way to do that. And you might argue that there's a bubble in private capital, you might argue that there's a bubble in crypto or those kind of things, but they have a willingness to invest in it, an appetite to invest in it. And during the interviews that I'm doing, they completely understand what they're doing. How do we allow both those markets to exist at the same time?
Yeah, I think inevitably you're right that people who have that discretionary dollar to invest will always find a way to make that sort of investment. What you would inevitably do by tightening the regulatory screws is just make it more inefficient for that person to find that investment opportunity. Platforms have done an amazing job at providing access to a whole range of investment options at a much more efficient low-cost process. And I think that innovation has been fantastic for the system. So I don't think we should be losing that. But what I think the government and regulators are trying to wrap their head around is how do we protect the sort of punters that rolled over into Shield and First Guardian from accessing products or channels that can be manipulated by bad actors? So how do we protect them while still keeping available to higher net wealth people the opportunity to invest their money the way they feel is appropriate?
Yeah, it's a vexed question and something that must be thinking on the minds of your members. Final question that I have, and again, question without notice. Every year we survey superannuation recipients and people who are investing in superannuation. One of the great bits that's interesting to us is people who are at the point of retirement where they often withdraw a lump sum and do something with that. In the past, up until 2 years ago, the most common destination for lump sums being withdrawn from the market was an Australian index fund. They would take it out and they'd buy Australian shares with it. You can argue whether that's good or bad. The past 2 years, the fastest growing sectors have been crypto and gold. Now, when we saw that in 2023, we kind of laughed and said, that's gambling. They've been right. They've done extremely well, the people who've been buying crypto and gold. That's not an investment strategy though, is it? That's a kind of a sector gamble.
Well, I try to be asset class neutral, to be honest. There are certainly asset classes that are more volatile. So gold did extremely well up until a few days ago, but then all of a sudden, if you were waiting the queue on Martin Place to buy bullion on Monday, you've probably lost a lot of money by now. So I suppose that the issue is around people taking uninformed risks. And it'll probably be music to your listeners' ears, but my view is there's nothing that replaces good quality financial advice. And so we've talked for years about affordable and accessible advice and the reforms needed to do that. It remains as important as ever, because what we've seen, not just in crypto, a little bit in bullion, is that people are willing to take some pretty sizable punts with a large portion of their wealth, and they might be pulling it out of their super when they retire for this purpose. There will be an inevitable downturn at some point. I don't know when it's going to be. No one does. We thought it could be over the last couple of years. It hasn't happened yet. Equity markets are still roaring ahead. But when there is a downturn, geez, I would hate to be one of those people that pulled out $500,000 out of their super at retirement, stuck it in a high-risk asset, and they've blown up their retirement and they've got no chance to get it back. So there is no replacement for good financial advice. I'll be honest.
Well, it's true. Year after year, the data tells us that the people who get financial advice make fewer mistakes, and that compounds out annually. Thank you so much for taking the time. This is going to be vexed, and it's going to be something that you're going to have to lean into the future. When your members are getting together and talking about this, is this something which is top of mind, Blake, or is it just another part of business?
We are having out-of-session board and board committee meetings working through these issues right now. I mean, it is, if you think about the FSC's membership across advice, business, funds management, superannuation funds, the fallout of what we're experiencing at the moment is touching every part of the FSC's membership. And from our perspective, there is a collective desire to try to resolve it in a sensible way about what sensible collection of industry action reforms actually get to the heart of the issue. Our biggest worry is that there is a knee-jerk reaction from either other parts of the industry or government, where the reforms that we get out of this are driven by self-interest and don't actually address the consumer harm.
It's very interesting. I was speaking to a customer in the UK about this, and we were talking about the fraud and the size of the fraud, and I mentioned how big it was, and he said, "How big's the industry?" And I said, "Give or take 3.5 trillion." He said, "That's a rounding error on 3.5 trillion. It's almost irrelevant." And I said, "Tell that to the people who've lost their money."
That's right, the 12,000 consumers.
Yeah.
And credit to people like Dr. Molino. He sits down and meets with them, and he sits through them when they tears in their eyes. And so you can't separate these discussions from the real consumer harm that occurred.
You're 100% right. The blast radius is significant. So let's call it 5% bad actors in the industry. That gives us kind of 800 or 900 advisors who may be bad actors. I'm not suggesting that's the case, but that's just the simple mathematics. If every one of them has let's call it 100 customers, it's a lot of people facing into risk, and the system needs to be able to clean that up as quickly as possible and to make it really difficult for people to do that. I think we're leaning into that pretty well, but in all these things, more could be done. Thank you so much for listening to us today. Obviously at CoreData, we're putting yet more research together about this. It's going to pop out in December, and it's a very deep look at what's going on and the processes. If you want to know more about it, get in touch. I'm Andrew at coredata.com.au, and we can share that information with you. Blake, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you.